Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today, my dear friends and subscribers and guests to this channel, I would like to talk once more about Ukraine, because there are new developments that are happening on a daily basis, and the topic of my today's presentation is how long can Ukraine last? In my previous presentation, I talked about President Zelensky and his hopes and dreams and how they're falling apart. But today my focus is on the Ukrainian society and the processes and trends that are unfolding there in view of the current situation, and that is the war in Iran on the one hand, the crisis of NATO on the other hand, and the relative rapprochement, or at least some kind of understanding between President Putin and President Trump. But let me start with the opposite view. There are many observers in the mass media, the Western and the European and American, that repeat essentially, as they have done for years, the conventional view that Ukraine is doing just fine. In fact, Lithuanians keep on talking about Ukrainian victory. Where did they get that idea? I don't know. Maybe it is their dreaming, their dreams and then visions. But the conventional view, those who share it, is that Ukraine may indeed last for years because Russian advance is slow. Russia will not be able to occupy all of Ukraine. It's just not strong enough. This is the view of Aristovich, the Ukrainian critic of Zelensky. The offensive is slow because of the drone wave, because of the continued flow of Western aid, and in specific terms, those who support this view argue that to take Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the two remaining cities in Donetsk province, will take about 3 to 4 months, and then one would need to cover another 50 kilometers to take all of the Zaporozhye province, and the Russians would be lucky if by the end of 2026 they would take 4 provinces that officially have already been declared part of the Russian Federation. And that leaves the question, what about the advance on Odessa? Will it happen or not? What about Kharkov? Now, the advance on these cities would make it even more difficult, because these are cities with over 1 million population in each, and the Russians cannot resort to carpet bombing or act as the Israelis did in Gaza, because these are Russian people, and they are expected to become citizens of the Russian Federation, so they cannot use the methods when there would be serious casualties of civilians. And the question, of course, is how would they be able, if at all, to occupy or to move into these territories? And the answer to me seems to be very simple. It is in the internal developments in Ukraine. And that is what I'd like to focus in, which are quite significant and new in terms of strategic planning and actual developments on the ground. So Ukraine needs 150 billion for the current 2026. Of those, when I did research, I found that Ukraine does have 70 billion from various loans and from its own domestic sources. Now, the deficit is 45 billion, and that would cover its expenses both for domestic, for pensions and various social programs, and of course for the war itself. And these $45 billion were supposed to be delivered by the European Union, which voted for it in December 2025. However, the money isn't coming. And originally, everybody assumed that it wasn't coming because of the opposition of Hungary. And as we all know, Hungary opposed any loans, any donations to Ukraine because Ukraine blocked the oil pipeline that goes from Russia through the territory of Ukraine to Hungary. Hungary depends on this oil, doesn't want to lose it, but Zelensky simply refused. And that caused a huge row between the two countries. And everybody thought, well, this is Hungary's fault or whatever. But Ukraine would get what it needed, the funds from European Union, and the only obstacle is Mr. Orban. Well, now Kaja Kallas came to Kiev a few days ago and announced that there is a problem with the delivery of 90 billion loan. The Europeans cannot deliver it, not only because of Orban, but because they need the money themselves. And that is the direct result of the war in Iran and the rising world prices on oil. Essentially, it means that oil is becoming more expensive and the gasoline is becoming more expensive, and local governments, such as in France, need more money for themselves to pay out all kinds of subsidies to the people that need them inside their societies, and therefore there's no money left for Ukraine. So, European Union cannot pay in the current conditions to Ukraine because they don't have enough for themselves. The second major new development is the crisis of NATO. And the whole world media is talking about Trump threats to quit NATO. And just today there was a speech by Secretary of State Rubio, who was talking about 60 billion that the United States is spending on Europe, that they're loafers, that America defended them and they refuse to help America when it needs them, and that United States is thinking of quitting NATO. Now, what it means in most direct terms is that the Europeans are on their own, at least they think they are, and they would need to spend more money for their own defense. This is now accepted by everyone. This is now axiomatic, that the supplies of missiles and Patriot missiles among them are limited, and nobody is in a hurry to pass this equipment to Ukraine. So the direct consequence of the Trump's threats to quit NATO is that there's less weaponry available for Ukraine and more weaponry needed for the European Union for its own defense. Now, the row over NATO, and especially Trump's insult of President Macron and his wife, had a consequence, which is that France, for the first time since 2003, voted together with China and Russia in the Security Council of the United Nations to veto a proposal of Bahrain to allow to use United Nations as a sanction allowing military force to open the Strait of Hormuz. Now that was vetoed, and it was the triple veto where France joined Russia. As a result of which, the Iranians allowed liquefied gas tanker bound for France to go through the Strait of Hormuz unimpeded. Now this is of course very disturbing for the United States and for those who are routing for NATO unity, because it actually breaks this unity and because it sends a clear message that it is possible to find a solution to import of oil once good relations or normal relations are restored with Iran. Now, if we leave that for a moment, the Iran topic, what is important for our topic, the crisis in Ukraine financing, is that the European Union is losing its capacity to finance the war in Ukraine. Now, one other interesting episode here is that President Putin is making an effort to stay in the shadows and at the same time keep his communications with President Trump. And one of the most important events on this agenda that was totally unnoticed by most media is the visit of the delegation of Russian parliamentarians, members of the Duma, to the United States Congress. And it was led by the head of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Duma. And it is quite significant as a message from Putin to Trump that the attempts to improve relations of the two countries are on track. And they discussed the restoration of air traffic and of cultural exchanges and of joint investments. In other words, Putin is continuing along the path of attracting Trump into joint investments in the Arctic and in oil and gas. And most importantly, he is offering him a communication channel to the Iranians in case they are ready to find a way out of the war. So, the result is that the domestic situation in Ukraine is getting more radicalized. The resistance to the war is becoming more and more visible. And that has to do with the so-called process of bussification. The word was coined in Ukraine, and it refers to busing. Busing not in American sense of taking children to school, but bussification in terms of throwing men into a bus by the recruitment agents of the army. The name in Ukraine is TCK agents, who essentially they're called men hunters. They go hunting for men, and they just essentially control. They can pull out anybody from a gas station, from a car, from the street, and then check their documents. And if they're of draft age, they essentially throw them into the bus. Hence the word bussification. Now, this has been going on for several years, but what's new now is that there's organized resistance to this bussification. Just a couple of days ago, a TCK agent was murdered in Lvov, just stabbed to death by a man who was afraid that he would be thrown into the bus and sent to the front to die. So the resistance is becoming more organized, and today I've heard about various kinds of techniques that men are using in Ukraine, such as that they would put the names of 4, 5, 6, 10 friends that are ready to defend them into their phone, and with one button press, they could activate help from these people. So as soon as TCK agents approach them, he pushes the button on his phone, and 10 friends are notified that he's in trouble, and then they come and they fight to liberate their friend from these buses. Sometimes they put those buses on fire. Sometimes they attack them in advance. Sometimes they attack the agencies and their headquarters. Sometimes they ambush them and destroy their buses. It's really becoming a kind of a national movement of resistance against the draft. And finally, my dear friends, if Zelensky, if we imagine for a moment that he is forced to and accepts Trump-Putin deal and signs this Russian conditions at the moment, then the predictions of Ukrainian observers is that he would be dead politically or physically. The nationalists would not accept this capitulation to Russia, and they would resist, and they would not agree to it. And there's possible all kinds of actions against him by the right nationalists, and at the same time by those who are ready to accept Russian conditions at whatever cost. In other words, Ukrainian society is being torn by the extremists and nationalists on the one hand, who want to continue the war and win over the Ruskies, and others who are tired of the war and who are ready to sign any peace as long as the war stops at any conditions whatsoever. And therefore, the mood in Ukraine is changing, and it is changing fast. And it seems to me that in a few months, the moment would come when there is no money left whatsoever, when there is no weaponry, when there is low morale in the army, and the growing resistance to continuing the war. And it could lead to unpredictable social consequences, including collapse of the Zelensky regime and civil strife. We don't know what exactly may happen, but dramatic events that would transform the Ukraine as we know it today. Thank you very much, and this is all for today. I want to remind you that I love answering your questions and comments, and that I invite you to look at other playlists that I have. One is called War in Ukraine, Soviet history, post-Soviet history, Russian history, European history. And those of you who would like to know more about me, I have a personal narratives playlist with information about my career and thoughts and ideas and books. And of course, the last but not least is I invite you to read my latest book, From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin. And at this moment, invite you to subscribe. Goodbye.